Sometimes a man reaches a place where he believes kindness has died in him forever. Clay Barden had lived 7 years in that cold certainty, alone in his mountain cabin, where winter stretched long and mercy seemed like something from another man's life. Then, one morning, he found a white wolf caught in barbed wire, bleeding into the snow. Any smart man would have walked away. Wild animals die in these mountains every day. But Clay knelt down and freed her with hands that remembered gentleness. She disappeared into the trees without a sound. The next morning, Clay stepped outside and froze. 200 wolves stood silent in the clearing around his cabin, watching him with yellow eyes. The white wolf sat at the front like she was waiting for something. What happened next would change everything Clay thought he knew about second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clay Barden hadn't always been a man who measured his days by the silence between them. Time was. He'd wake to the sound of small feet racing down hardwood hallways and Sarah humming over coffee that steamed up the kitchen windows. That was before the fire took everything worth having and left him with nothing but the weight of what he should have done different. The photograph lived in a rusted tobacco tin beneath loose floorboards near his bed. He hadn't looked at it in 2 years, but he knew every detail by heart. Sarah's hand resting on Tommy's shoulder, little Jake grinning with his front tooth missing, all of them squinting into summer sunlight outside the ranch house he'd built with his own hands. Clay had been in town that night, settling accounts at the bank, staying late over whiskey with old friends who wanted to talk cattle prices and weather patterns. By the time he saw the orange glow against the sky, by the time he drove that truck, harder than it was ever meant to go, there was nothing left but charred timber and 3 graves he'd have to dig come morning. 7 years had worn the edges off that pain, but it never truly left. It just settled deeper, like water finding the bedrock. Up here in the Bitterroot Mountains, where the nearest neighbor lived 40 miles down a road that disappeared under snow 5 months out of the year, a man could carry his grief without having to explain it to anyone. Clay's cabin sat in a clearing he'd carved from lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, backed against granite cliffs that caught the morning sun and held it like a cupped hand. He'd built it solid, thick logs chinked tight against wind, a stone chimney that drew clean, windows placed to catch light but not expose him to anything that might be watching from the tree line. The routine kept him breathing. Dawn came with coffee boiled over a wood fire and biscuits baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven his grandfather had carried west, in a covered wagon. Clay would check his snares and trap lines, following paths he'd worn smooth through 7 winters of walking the same ground. Afternoons meant splitting wood or mending gear, small tasks that kept his hands busy while his mind stayed carefully empty. Evenings brought the kind of silence that city folks paid good money to experience for a weekend, though they never stayed long enough to understand how it could hollow a man out if he let it. But this morning was different. The wolves were still there. Clay stood at his kitchen window, tin cup of coffee warming his palms, counting shapes that shouldn't exist. Timber wolves had been hunted near to extinction in these mountains decades ago. Even if a few packs survived in the deepest wilderness, they didn't behave like this. Wild wolves avoided humans, moved at night, scattered at the first hint of human scent. These animals sat in his clearing like they'd been invited to Sunday dinner. The white wolf, the one he'd freed from that tangle of barbed wire yesterday morning, held position at the front of the pack. She was larger than the others. Her coat, the color of fresh snow, with pale yellow eyes that seemed to hold more intelligence than any wild animal had a right to possess. Around her, the rest of the pack arranged itself in loose formation, some lying with their heads on their paws, others sitting alert but relaxed. They looked like soldiers at ease, but ready. Clay had spent enough years hunting and trapping to recognize unusual animal behavior when he saw it. Predators didn't lounge around human habitation unless they were sick, starving, or protecting something. These wolves appeared healthy and well-fed, Their coats gleamed with condition, their movements fluid and strong. Yet here they sat, 200 strong if his count was right, watching his cabin like they were waiting for something. He'd tried leaving the previous evening, thinking they'd disperse once he was gone. The moment he stepped onto his porch, every head turned toward him in perfect unison. Not aggressive, not threatening, just watching. When he took a step toward the tree line, the white wolf stood. Just stood there, those pale eyes fixed on his, and something in her posture made it clear that leaving wasn't part of whatever plan was unfolding here. So Clay had gone back inside, barred his door, and spent a restless night listening to the sounds of a wolf pack settling in for a long stay. He'd heard them moving around in the darkness, the soft whisper of paws on snow, occasional low whines or huffs of communication. But no howling, no aggressive sounds, nothing that suggested they meant him harm. If anything, the sounds had been almost domestic, like having a large, very quiet family camping in his yard. Now, in the cold light of morning, they were still there. And Clay was beginning to understand that whatever had started when he freed that white wolf from the barbed wire, it wasn't going to end with him simply waiting them out. He'd been a practical man once, back when practical mattered. The Clay Barden who'd built a successful cattle ranch and raised 2 boys to know the difference between right and wrong wouldn't have hesitated to grab his rifle and scatter this pack with a few warning shots. But 7 years of mountain living had taught him that the wilderness operated by different rules than the civilized world. Up here, survival often depended on knowing when to fight and when to pay attention. The white wolf turned her head, looking directly at his window. For a moment, Clay had the unsettling feeling that she could see him clearly through the glass, that she was aware of his thoughts in ways that defied everything he knew about animal behavior. Her gaze held steady, patient, almost expectant. Then she rose to her feet in one fluid motion and began walking toward his cabin. Clay set down his coffee cup and moved away from the window. His rifle hung on pegs. Above the stone fireplace, a Winchester, 30-06, that had never failed him in all his years of hunting. He could have it loaded and ready in seconds. But something held him back, some instinct that whispered this wasn't a situation to be solved with gunpowder and lead. Instead, he pulled on his heavy coat and wool-lined boots. If this white wolf wanted a conversation, he'd give her one. But it would be on his terms, at his pace, with his hand close to the knife on his belt and his eyes watching for any sign that mercy had been mistaken for weakness. The morning air bit sharp when he opened the door, cold enough to make his breath visible in pale puffs. The wolf pack shifted slightly at his appearance, heads lifting, ears pricking forward, but no one moved from their positions. The white wolf stopped about 10 feet from his porch steps and sat down, her tail curled around her front paws, like a house dog waiting for permission to come inside. "Well," Clay said quietly, his voice rusty, from disuse, "I suppose you've got something to say." The white wolf tilted her head at the sound of his voice, and Clay could have sworn he saw understanding flicker in those pale eyes. She made a sound, not quite a whine, not quite a bark, but something that seemed almost conversational. Behind her, the rest of the pack remained motionless, watching but not interfering. Clay stepped down from his porch, moving slow and deliberate. The wolf's gaze never left his face, but she didn't retreat as he approached. When he stopped arm's length away, she stood and moved closer, until Clay could see the faint scars on her muzzle where the barbed wire had cut deep. Up close, she was even more impressive, probably 90 pounds of muscle and bone, with intelligence burning in her eyes like banked coals. "You're not from around here," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "Wolves like you don't exist in these mountains anymore, haven't for 50 years or more." She made that conversational sound again, and Clay felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he couldn't quite name. It had been 7 years since he'd spoken to another living being with any expectation of being understood. 7 years since he'd looked into eyes that seemed to look back with purpose. The white wolf stepped closer still until Clay could feel the warmth radiating from her thick coat. She lifted her muzzle and sniffed delicately at his outstretched hand, her wet nose cold against his palm. Then, with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who thought they understood wild animals, she pressed her head against his hand. Clay's breath caught in his throat. The last time anything had sought comfort from his touch, it had been little Jake crawling into his lap with a scraped knee, trusting completely in his father's ability to make the hurt go away. Now this impossible wolf was asking for something similar, not healing, but acknowledgement, connection, the simple comfort of not being alone. "I freed you because it was the right thing to do," Clay whispered, his hand moving of its own accord to scratch behind her ears. "Didn't expect payment, didn't expect company." The white wolf pulled back and looked at him with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. Then she turned and walked back to her position at the front of the pack, settling down with the patience of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary. Clay stood in his clearing, surrounded by 200 wolves who had apparently decided his isolated life was about to become considerably less isolated, and realized that for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't entirely sure what tomorrow would bring. That uncertainty, he discovered, felt almost like hope. 3 days later, Clay discovered what the wolves had been waiting for. He woke before dawn to the sound of engines echoing off the canyon walls, the deep rumble of heavy trucks grinding up the old logging road that dead-ended a quarter-mile from his cabin. Clay had chosen this location precisely because that road was nearly impassable most of the year, washed out by spring runoff and blocked by deadfall that discouraged casual visitors. In 7 years, he'd seen maybe a dozen vehicles attempt the climb, and most turned back before reaching the top. But these engines kept coming, straining against gravity and rough ground with the determination of men who had business to finish. Clay rolled from his bunk and moved to the window, his bare feet silent on the plank floor. The wolf pack was already alert, every head turned toward the sound of approaching vehicles. The white wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, her posture rigid with tension Clay had never seen in her before. Around her, the pack was rising to its feet with an urgency that made the hair on Clay's neck prickle. 4 trucks crested the ridge, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like pale fingers. They moved in convoy, formation, each vehicle heavy and purpose-built for rough country. Even from this distance, Clay could see the outline of equipment loaded in their beds, machinery that gleamed dull metal under the morning stars. The lead truck stopped at the edge of the clearing, its engine idling rough in the thin mountain air. 3 men climbed out, their movements careful and deliberate. They wore the kind of clothes that cost serious money, high-end outdoor gear that looked fresh from the catalogue, boots that had never seen honest work. City men playing at being outdoorsmen, but something in the way they carried themselves suggested they weren't here for recreation. Clay reached for his rifle, then hesitated. The wolves hadn't moved from their positions, but their body language had changed completely. Where before they'd seemed relaxed, almost domestic, now they looked like what they truly were, apex predators assessing a threat. The white wolf took 3 steps forward, placing herself directly between the trucks and Clay's cabin, her lips pulled back just enough to show the tips of her canine teeth. "Mr. Barden." The tallest of the 3 men called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "My name is Marcus Webb. We need to talk." Clay stepped onto his porch, the Winchester held loose but ready across his chest. "Don't recall sending any invitations," he called back. "This is private property, gentlemen. You'll want to turn around and head back down the mountain." Webb smiled, the expression sharp and cold in the growing light. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "See, there's been some confusion about the ownership of this particular piece of land. Confusion that recent surveys and legal research have cleared up considerably." The white wolf's growl was so low, Clay felt it more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Behind her, the ponder, The rest of the pack began to shift positions, spreading out in a loose semicircle that put the newcomers at a distinct disadvantage. Clay had seen wolves hunt before, knew the patience they brought to surrounding prey. These men had walked into something they didn't understand. "I've got clear title to this land," Clay said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. "Bought it fair and square 7 years ago. Whatever papers you're carrying, they don't change that fact." Webb's smile widened. "Actually, they do. See, the original survey of this section was flawed. The land you thought you purchased, well, it turns out it was never legally owned by the man who sold it to you. Which makes your purchase invalid. Which makes you a squatter." Behind Webb, his companions were unloading equipment from the trucks with practiced efficiency. Clay recognized the gear now: surveying equipment, drilling apparatus, sample containers. These weren't lawyers or government officials. They were prospectors. "Mineral rights," Clay said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "You found something up here." "Rare earth elements," Webb confirmed, his pretense of politeness dropping away like a discarded mask. "Specifically, a deposit that preliminary surveys suggest could be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million, which makes this little patch of wilderness considerably more valuable than whatever sentimental attachment you might have to it." The white wolf took another step forward, and this time her growl was audible, a sound like distant thunder that made the three men glance nervously at each other. Clay noticed they hadn't brought any weapons that he could see, at least nothing visible. They'd come expecting to intimidate a lonely mountain man into compliance through legal paperwork and corporate pressure. They hadn't planned on the wolves. "Even if your papers are legitimate," Clay said, "eviction is a legal process. Takes time, court orders, sheriff's deputies, not corporate thugs in fancy trucks." Webb's laugh held no humor. "Mr. Barden, I think you're operating under some misconceptions about how things work in the modern world. Technocore Industries doesn't wait for lengthy legal proceedings when valuable resources are at stake. We prefer more immediate solutions." One of Webb's companions had finished setting up a piece of surveying equipment and was now taking readings across the clearing. The other was photographing Clay's cabin from multiple angles, documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone building a case file. "The way I see it," Webb continued, "you have two options. Option 1, you pack your belongings and leave voluntarily. Today, we'll even provide transportation down the mountain and a modest compensation package for your inconvenience." "And option 2, Clay asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Option 2 is considerably less pleasant for you." The white wolf's response was immediate and unmistakable. Her growl deepened to a snarl that raised the hair on every man's arms, and suddenly the entire wolf pack was moving. Not attacking, not yet, but flowing like grey water between the trees, positioning themselves with the tactical precision of a military unit. Within seconds, Webb and his men found themselves surrounded by predators who had appeared as silently as morning mist. "Jesus Christ," one of Webb's companions whispered, his voice tight with fear. "How many are there?" 200, give or take," Clay said mildly. "They showed up a few days ago, seemed to have taken a liking to the place." Webb's composure cracked for the first time, his face going pale as he counted the yellow eyes gleaming from the forest shadows. "This is impossible. There aren't supposed to be wolves in these mountains." "Lot of impossible things in these mountains," Clay replied. "Most of them tend to be unfriendly toward folks who don't show proper respect." The surveyor had stopped taking readings and was backing slowly toward the trucks, his expensive equipment forgotten in the face of immediate mortality. His companion was no longer photographing the cabin, he was calculating distances to the nearest vehicle and finding the math distinctly unfavorable. Webb tried to regain control of the situation, his voice rising with false authority. "These are just animals, Barden. A few rifle shots will scatter them quick enough. And if you think some pack of wild dogs is going to intimidate Technocore Industries, you're about to learn how wrong you can be." The white wolf's response, was to take 3 more steps forward, close enough now that Webb could see the intelligent fire burning in her pale eyes. She sat down directly in front of him, her massive frame radiating the kind of calm confidence that apex predators wore when they knew the hunt was already over. "Tell you what, mister." "Webb," Clay said, hefting his rifle slightly. "Why don't you and your boys pack up that fancy equipment and head back down the mountain? Give me some time to review those documents of yours with a lawyer who doesn't work for mining companies. If your claim is legitimate, we'll sort it out proper. If not, well, these wolves seem to have strong opinions about claim jumpers." Webb looked around at the circle of predators watching him with patient hunger, then back at Clay, standing calm and steady on his porch. For a moment the corporate mask slipped completely, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "This isn't over, Barden. Technocore doesn't walk away from $200 million because some hermit made friends with a few wild animals." "Maybe not," Clay agreed. "But they might walk away from becoming wolf food." The retreat was hasty but orderly, city men loading equipment with hands that shook just slightly, engines turning over with the urgency of escape. As the convoy disappeared back down the mountain road, the wolf pack began to settle back into their relaxed positions around the clearing. But the white wolf remained standing, her gaze fixed on the spot where the trucks had vanished, her body language making it clear that this encounter was just the beginning. Clay stood on his porch, watching the last of the dust settle, and realized that his 7 years of peaceful isolation had just come to an abrupt end. Whatever these wolves had been waiting for, whatever purpose had brought them to his door, it was connected to the fortune in rare earth elements buried beneath his mountain home. And judging by the white wolf's expression, the real fight hadn't even started yet. The white wolf didn't leave Clay's side for the rest of that day. She followed him as he checked the perimeter of his property, padding silently through the underbrush while he examined every tree, every rock outcropping, every natural defensive position his 40 acres offered. When he knelt to study the tire tracks Webb's convoy had left in the soft earth, she sat beside him, her pale eyes scanning the forest with the intensity of a sentry on watch. Clay had spent 7 years learning to read the mountain's moods, understanding how weather moved through the valleys, where game trails crossed, which ridges caught the wind. But walking his land with the white wolf beside him revealed details he'd never noticed. She would stop at seemingly random spots, sniffing the ground with focused attention, then look at him as if expecting him to understand something important. When he knelt to examine what had caught her interest, he found signs he'd missed boot prints from previous visits, places where equipment had been set up and hastily removed, evidence that Technocore's interest in his land wasn't as recent as Webb had made it seem. "They've been watching," Clay murmured, running his fingers over a depression in the earth where a surveying tripod had stood. "How long, you think?" The wolf made that conversational sound he was beginning to recognize, a low rumble that seemed almost like agreement. Then she led him to another spot 20 yards away, where someone had drilled a small core sample hole and tried to disguise it with fallen branches. By evening, they'd found evidence of at least 6 previous visits, all carefully hidden, but not quite well enough to escape the white wolf's keen senses. Clay sat on his porch as darkness settled over the mountain, the wolf lying beside his chair like an enormous dog, while he tried to piece together what he'd learned. The legal documents Webb had shown him were probably legitimate. Corporate lawyers didn't make threats they couldn't back up with paperwork, which meant someone had been planning this takeover for months, maybe years. The rare earth deposit wasn't a recent discovery. It was something Technocore had known about long enough to research land ownership records, identify legal vulnerabilities, and plan their approach. Clay reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the artifact that had been weighing on his mind all day, Sarah's wedding ring. He'd found it in the ashes of their burned home, the only thing that had survived the fire intact. For 7 years, he'd carried it everywhere, a reminder of what he'd lost and why he deserved to lose it. But now, rolling the simple gold band between his fingers while the white wolf watched with those intelligent eyes, he wondered if carrying guilt like a stone had made him miss signs that someone was circling his new life like vultures. "I failed them," he said quietly, knowing the wolf couldn't understand his words, but needing to speak them anyway. Should have been there, should have protected what mattered. The white wolf lifted her head and looked at him directly, and Clay felt that strange recognition again, the sense that she understood more than any wild animal should. Then she did, something that made his breath catch. She rose to her feet, moved closer to his chair, and gently placed her massive head in his lap. The weight of her was warm and solid, real in a way that cut through 7 years of numbness. Clay's hand moved instinctively to stroke the thick fur behind her ears, and for a moment he felt something he'd thought was dead forever, the simple comfort of not being entirely alone with his mistakes. "Don't know why you're here," he whispered. "Don't know what you want from a broken-down man who can't protect anything that matters. But if you're planning to stick around for whatever's coming next, you should know what you're getting into." The wolf's response was to settle more comfortably against his legs, her breathing slow and steady in the mountain quiet. Around the clearing, the rest of the pack had arranged itself in loose formation, some sleeping, others keeping watch, all of them positioned with the tactical awareness of soldiers who expected trouble. Clay spent that night planning instead of sleeping. He walked through his cabin by lamplight, taking inventory of everything that might matter in the days ahead. His grandfather's rifle was solid and reliable, but he only had about 50 rounds of ammunition. His food stores would last a month if he was careful, longer if the wolves proved to be effective hunters, though the ethics of accepting help from predators felt complicated in ways he wasn't ready to examine. More importantly, he had skills Technocore probably didn't expect from a mountain hermit. Before the fire, before the grief, Clay Barden had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Army Corps of Engineers. He knew explosives, defensive positioning, and the kind of unconventional warfare that turned geographical advantages into force multipliers. The corporate thugs who'd visited his clearing were used to intimidating civilians with legal documents and economic pressure. They weren't prepared for someone who understood that mountains could be fortified and defended. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was defending against. At dawn, Clay loaded his pack with enough supplies for several days and headed down the mountain toward the nearest town. The white wolf followed him to the edge of his property, then stopped and sat down, watching him go with what looked like patient understanding. When he glanced back from the ridgeline, she was still there, a pale sentinel against the dark trees. Millfield had been dying slowly for 20 years, ever since the timber industry moved on to cheaper forests in other states. Half the storefronts on Main Street were boarded up, and the ones still operating catered mostly to hunters and tourists passing through to better destinations. But Millfield still had 2 things. Clay needed a library with internet access and a bar where locals gathered to share gossip. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who remembered Clay from his occasional supply runs, helped him access the computer terminals without asking too many questions about why a mountain hermit suddenly needed to research corporate mining law. What Clay found made his blood run cold. Technocore Industries specialized in what they called aggressive resource acquisition. They'd operated in 17 states over the past decade, always targeting remote properties where isolated landowners couldn't mount effective legal resistance. Their standard operating procedure involved identifying mineral deposits through illegal preliminary surveys, researching property ownership for legal vulnerabilities, then moving in with overwhelming legal and economic pressure to force quick sales or abandonment. In every case, Clay could find documentation for property owners who refused initial buyout offers, faced escalating harassment, equipment sabotage, utility service interruptions, and what company lawyers carefully described as security concerns that made continued residence inadvisable. 2 property owners in Montana had suffered accidents that left them permanently disabled and financially ruined. 3 families in Wyoming had simply disappeared, their properties reverting to state ownership when no heirs could be located. Clay printed every relevant document he could find, using cash to pay for copies and making sure to clear the computer's browsing history when he finished. As he walked toward the Elkhorn Tavern, Sarah's ring heavy in his pocket and a folder full of evidence under his arm, he realized that Webb's visit hadn't been the beginning of his troubles. It had been a declaration of war. The Elkhorn Tavern smelled like stale beer and wood smoke, the kind of place where men came to forget troubles they couldn't solve with honest work. Clay claimed a corner table where he could watch the door and ordered coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since morning, the handful of locals nursing drinks in the afternoon. Gloom paid him no attention. Mountain hermits were common enough in this part of Montana that his presence barely registered. He was halfway through the folder of documents when Jim Kowalski slid into the chair across from him. Jim had been the county sheriff for 15 years, a steady man who understood that keeping peace in the wilderness required knowing when to bend rules and when to enforce them without compromise. "Heard you had visitors up on the mountain," Jim said without preamble, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed in the bar's dim light. Clay looked up from a legal document describing mineral extraction rights. News travels fast for a place with no cell towers. Faster when those visitors stop by my office asking about local law enforcement response times to remote properties. Jim's expression was carefully neutral, but Clay could see the concern in his eyes. "Technocore Industries. Ring any bells? They claim I'm squatting on land I don't own." Clay passed the manila folder across the table. "Found some interesting reading about their business practices." Jim spent 10 minutes reviewing the documents, his frown deepening with each page. When he finished, he set the folder down and leaned back in his chair. "This is bad, Clay. Real bad. These people don't play games." "So," I gathered. Clay retrieved the folder and tucked it back under his arm. "Question is, what can local law enforcement do about corporate lawyers with legal documents?" "Legally? Not much, if their paperwork is solid." Jim's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Unofficially, I can tell you that Marcus Webb asked very specific questions about your property's location, access routes, and how long it would take my deputies to respond to a disturbance call." Clay felt ice form in his stomach. "They're planning something." "They're planning everything," Jim corrected. "Webb's got a team of 12 men staying at the Mountain View Motor Lodge. Expensive equipment, military-grade communications gear, and enough firepower to outfit a small army. They're not here to file paperwork." The artifact Clay had been carrying since leaving his cabin suddenly felt heavier in his pocket, a small leather journal that had belonged to his grandfather, filled with hand-drawn maps of every cave, mine shaft, and natural fortification in the Bitterroot Range. 3 generations of Bardens had explored these mountains, and their knowledge was recorded in careful pencil sketches and precise compass bearings. "Jim," Clay said carefully, "if someone wanted to make a stand in these mountains, how long could they hold out against superior numbers?" The sheriff studied Clay's face for a long moment. "Depends on the terrain, the defender's knowledge, and how badly the attackers want what they're after." He paused. "Also depends on whether that someone has backup coming. And if they don't?" Jim's smile was grim. "Then they better know those. Mountains like their own heartbeat, and they better be prepared to fight like their life depends on it." He leaned forward. "Clay, I've known you since you first came up here after the fire. You're a good man who's been through hell. But Technocore isn't some grief you can hide from in the wilderness. They're coming whether you're ready or not." Clay nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Jim wasn't saying directly. Local law enforcement couldn't intervene in a corporate land dispute, but a county sheriff might be slow to respond to reports of trespassing on disputed property, especially if that sheriff happened to be dealing with paperwork delays and communication problems. "How much time do I have?" "Webb's team is scheduled to return to your property tomorrow morning." They'll come in force this time, probably with a court order for immediate possession. Jim stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. There've been some unusual animal sightings reported around your buck area. Fish and Game got calls about wolf activity. That so? Strange thing is, the descriptions don't match any known wolf populations in Montana. Too large, wrong coloration, behavior patterns that don't fit established pack dynamics. Jim's eyes held steady on Clay's face, almost like someone's protecting that property with predators that shouldn't exist. Clay kept his expression neutral. Mountains are full of strange things. That they are. Jim headed for the door, then turned back one last time. Clay, whatever's happening up there, whatever those wolves are, be careful. Some kinds of help come with prices that aren't clear until it's too late to pay them. After Jim left, Clay sat alone in the dim tavern, turning his grandfather's journal over in his hands. The old man had been a prospector himself, back in the days when men worked claims with pickaxes and determination. His maps showed every defensive position in 50 square miles, every escape route, every natural advantage these mountains offered to someone who knew how to use them. But Clay's grandfather had never faced corporate mercenaries with military equipment and legal backing. The rules had changed since the old days, and not in favor of the little man. Clay opened the journal to a map showing his property and the surrounding terrain. His grandfather's careful annotations marked elevation changes, sight lines, and what he'd labeled strong positions for a small force. The White Wolf had been leading him to these same locations during their patrol of the property boundary, showing him defensive advantages with the instincts of a military strategist. As he studied the hand-drawn maps, Clay began to understand that tomorrow's confrontation wasn't going to be resolved with lawyers and paperwork. Technocore was coming with force, expecting to deal with a grieving hermit who would fold under pressure. They had no idea they were walking into a war zone defended by someone who understood explosives, tactical positioning, and the kind of asymmetric warfare that turned geographical knowledge into lethal advantage. More importantly, they had no idea about the wolves. Clay finished his coffee, left money on the table, and walked out into the afternoon light. The drive back to his mountain would take 2 hours, and he had preparations to make before dark. Tomorrow, Technocore Industries would learn that some men didn't break under pressure. They transformed into something far more dangerous than corporate lawyers knew how to handle. Clay reached his property as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and red that reminded him too much of fire. The White Wolf was waiting at the edge of his clearing, exactly where he'd left her that morning, but her posture told him immediately that something had changed. She led him through the forest without hesitation, moving with purpose toward the southern boundary of his land. The rest of the pack materialized from the shadows as they walked, flowing between the trees like gray ghosts, until Clay found himself at the center of a moving formation that felt distinctly military in its precision. They stopped at a ridge overlooking the old logging road. Below, parked in a meadow that offered concealment from aerial observation, sat a collection of vehicles that made Clay's blood run cold. 3 black SUVs with government plates, a communications van bristling with antennas, and 2 heavy trucks loaded with equipment covered by military-grade tarps. Men moved between the vehicles with the disciplined efficiency of a professional unit, setting up what looked like a forward operating base. Clay pulled out his grandfather's journal and compared the terrain below to the hand-drawn maps. The meadow was marked with his grandfather's careful notation: death trap, no escape routes, overlooks from 3 sides. Someone had chosen that location either through ignorance or because they wanted to be found. The White Wolf pressed against his shoulder, a warm presence in the gathering darkness, and made a sound that seemed almost like a question. Clay understood. She was asking if he wanted them eliminated. "No," he whispered, surprised by how easily he'd interpreted her meaning. "Not yet. Need to know what we're facing first." She tilted her head, those pale eyes reflecting starlight, then led him to a different vantage point where they could observe without being seen. Clay counted 12 men, just as Jim had predicted, but their equipment suggested capabilities far beyond what corporate security typically carried. Night vision gear, tactical communications, weapons that belonged in military armories rather than private security companies. One figure moved between the others with obvious authority, and even at this distance Clay recognized Marcus Webb's expensive outdoor gear and commanding presence. But Webb wasn't giving orders, he was taking them from someone Clay couldn't see clearly, a figure that stayed near the communications van and seemed to coordinate the team's activities through radio contact with parties unknown. Clay opened his grandfather's journal to a page he'd studied during the drive up the mountain. His grandfather's careful handwriting described a network of old mine shafts and natural caves that honeycombed the mountainside, connected by passages that predated any modern survey. The entrance to the main network lay hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural, but had been carefully arranged to provide concealed access. The artifact he needed was already in his cabin, a dynamite cache his grandfather had left behind decades ago, carefully wrapped and stored in a dry cave behind the cabin. Enough explosive to bring down half the mountainside if positioned correctly, or to create diversions that would split an enemy force and defeat it in detail. But first, Clay needed to understand exactly what he was facing. The White Wolf seemed to sense his intention. She led him through a series of game trails that wound down the mountainside, staying well clear of the temporary camp while providing multiple observation points. At each stop, Clay learned something new about Technocore's operation. They had satellite communication capability, which meant they could call for reinforcement or air support if things went wrong. Their vehicles were armored, designed to withstand small arms fire and explosive devices. Most concerning, their equipment included what looked like seismic sensors, devices capable of detecting underground movement through solid rock. Clay realized with growing unease that Technocore knew about the mine shafts. They'd done their homework thoroughly, anticipating that any resistance would try to use the mountain's natural defenses. Tomorrow's assault wouldn't be a simple intimidation tactic. It would be a professional military operation designed to neutralize a prepared defender, using overwhelming force and tactical superiority. As they made their way back to his cabin, the White Wolf led Clay through areas he'd never explored in 7 years of mountain living. Hidden valleys where the pack had made temporary dens, water sources that didn't appear on any map, and observation points that provided sightlines across the entire region. She was showing him the mountain from a predator's perspective, revealing tactical advantages that human eyes would miss. By midnight, Clay had a clear picture of both his advantages and his problems. The wolves gave him intelligence gathering and mobility that no human force could match. His knowledge of explosives and defensive positioning, combined with his grandfather's maps, provided strategic options that Technocore couldn't anticipate. But he was still one man facing 12 professionals with superior equipment and unlimited backing. Unless the wolves were willing to do more than observe, Clay stood in his cabin, surrounded by the weapons and supplies he'd gathered for tomorrow's fight, while the White Wolf lay near the fireplace, watching him with those intelligent eyes. Sarah's wedding ring felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder of what happened when he failed to protect what mattered. His grandfather's journal lay open on the table, decades of mountain wisdom waiting to be put to use. And outside, 200 wolves waited for orders from a leader they'd chosen for reasons Clay still didn't understand. "I won't ask you to die for my mistakes," Clay said quietly, knowing the White Wolf couldn't understand his words, but needing to speak them anyway. "Whatever brought you here, whatever debt you think you owe, it's not worth getting killed by corporate mercenaries." The White Wolf rose to her feet and padded across the cabin until she stood directly in front of him. Then, with deliberate ceremony, she placed one massive paw on his grandfather's journal and looked him in the eyes. The message was unmistakable. This mountain belonged to all of them now, and they would defend it together, no matter the cost. Clay knelt and placed his hand on her head, feeling the strength and intelligence that burned behind those pale eyes. "All right then," he whispered. "But we do this smart. We do this like warriors, not like fools rushing toward death." The white wolf's response was a sound somewhere between a growl and a purr agreement, determination, and something that might have been affection, all rolled into one. Outside, the night was filled with the soft sounds of a wolf pack preparing for war. Tomorrow would bring fire and violence to his mountain sanctuary. But for the first time in 7 years, Clay Barden wouldn't be facing his enemies alone. Dawn came grey and cold, with storm clouds building against the peaks that promised snow before nightfall. Clay had been awake since 3, moving through his final preparations with the methodical precision of a soldier, preparing for battle. The white wolf hadn't left his side, watching as he checked equipment, loaded weapons, and positioned the charges that would turn his mountain sanctuary into a fortress or a tomb. The artifact that had guided his defensive planning lay spread across his kitchen table, a detailed topographical map his grandfather had annotated with 40 years of exploration. Every cave entrance, every natural choke point, every defensive position was marked in faded pencil, creating a tactical manual for asymmetric warfare in the Bitterroot Mountains. Clay had spent the dark hours transferring that knowledge to his own memory, visualizing fields of fire and escape routes until he could navigate the mountain blindfolded. But as morning light revealed the extent of Technocore's preparation, Clay realized his grandfather's maps might not be enough. The enemy force had moved during the night, abandoning their meadow camp for positions that suggested professional military planning. 3 teams of 4 had established observation posts on elevated ground surrounding his property, while their heavy equipment remained concealed in the valley below. Whoever was running this operation understood mountain warfare and had positioned his forces to prevent exactly the kind of guerrilla tactics Clay was planning. The white wolf led him to a ridge where they could observe without being detected, and what Clay saw made his stomach tighten with recognition. The man directing Technocore's assault wasn't Marcus Webb. It was someone whose movements and tactical positioning Clay had seen before. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where American soldiers fought an enemy that knew every rock and shadow. Colonel David Reeves. Clay recognized him despite the civilian clothes and the years that had passed since their last encounter. Reeves had been Clay's commanding officer during his 2nd deployment, a career soldier who understood unconventional warfare because he'd spent decades fighting it. If Technocore had hired Reeves to handle this operation, they weren't taking chances with legal intimidation or corporate pressure. They were planning to eliminate Clay Barden as a threat to their mining operation. "Son of a bitch," Clay whispered, watching Reeves coordinate his teams with hand signals that brought back unwelcome memories. They brought in real professionals. The white wolf made that questioning sound, and Clay found himself explaining the situation as if she could understand tactical analysis. "That man down there trained me, taught me everything I know about explosives and defensive positioning. He's going to anticipate every move I make because he's the one who taught me how to make it." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Clay noticed something that gave him hope. Reeves was planning his assault as if he were facing a human enemy using conventional tactics. He'd positioned his men to counter explosive charges, observation posts, and escape routes, all the standard methods a trained soldier would employ when defending difficult terrain. He hadn't planned for wolves. Clay opened his grandfather's map to a section marked "Deep Caves Dangerous Access." According to the old man's careful notes, a network of natural passages connected the mountain's defensive positions through routes that required crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a man. The passages were unmarked on any official survey, known only to someone who'd spent decades exploring every crack and crevice in the limestone. More importantly, the passages were large enough for wolves. "Can you get the pack into those caves?" Clay asked, tracing the route with his finger. The white wolf studied the map with an intensity that would have seemed impossible in any other animal. then made a sound that Clay interpreted as confirmation. The plan that formed in Clay's mind was dangerous beyond anything he'd attempted in Afghanistan, but it played to the one advantage Technocore couldn't counter: the intelligence and mobility of 200 wolves who could move through the mountain's heart like blood through arteries. Clay spent the morning setting charges at every position his grandfather's map identified as tactically significant. But instead of creating defensive barriers, he was building a network of diversions designed to drive Reeves's teams exactly where the wolves would be waiting. Each explosion would force the assault teams to take cover in specific locations, channeling them through choke points where superior numbers meant nothing and military training became a liability. The White Wolf accompanied him on every placement, seeming to understand the tactical purpose behind each charge. When Clay positioned the final device, a shaped charge that would bring down the rockslide, concealing the main cave entrance, she led him through a passage so narrow he had to remove his pack to fit through. They emerged in a cavern that took Clay's breath away. Natural limestone formations created a cathedral space lit by shafts of sunlight streaming through hidden openings. The entire wolf pack was assembled here, arranged in formation with the discipline of a military unit awaiting orders. Their yellow eyes reflected the dim light like stars, and their collective silence held the weight of expectation. The White Wolf moved to the center of the cavern and turned to face Clay, her posture making it clear that this was the moment of decision. She had brought him to the heart of her domain, shown him the truth behind their impossible appearance in his mountains. These weren't ordinary wolves, they were something older, something connected to the mountain itself in ways that defied modern understanding. Clay pulled out Sarah's wedding ring, holding it up so the gold caught the filtered sunlight. For 7 years, he'd carried this reminder of his failure, the weight of lives he couldn't protect. But looking at 200 predators who had chosen to stand with him against overwhelming odds, he realized that guilt and redemption weren't opposites, they were different sides of the same choice. "All right," he said, his voice echoing in the limestone cathedral. "You want to protect this mountain? Then we do it right. We do it together. And we make sure Technocore understands that some things can't be bought, sold, or taken by force." The White Wolf's howl filled the cavern like music, a sound that spoke of wild places and ancient promises. The pack's response built slowly, 200 voices joining in harmony that seemed to make the mountain itself vibrate with purpose. Outside, Clay knew that Colonel Reeves would be hearing that sound and wondering what he'd gotten his men into. By sunset, he would have his answer. The war for Clay's mountain was about to begin. The attack came at noon, when the sun was directly overhead and shadows were short standard military timing designed to minimize concealment opportunities for defenders. Clay watched from his concealed position in the rocks above his cabin as Reeves's teams moved with textbook precision, advancing by bounds while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. Everything unfolded exactly as Clay had predicted, which meant his countermeasures were perfectly positioned to channel the assault teams exactly where he wanted them. What Clay hadn't predicted was the helicopter. The aircraft appeared without warning, rising from behind the eastern ridge with the silent approach that only military pilots achieved through years of combat experience. It was a civilian model, painted corporate colors, but Clay recognized the modifications: armor plating around the cockpit, weapon mounts that could accept everything from machine guns to rocket pods, and the kind of sophisticated electronics package that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Through his binoculars, Clay could see Marcus Webb in the passenger compartment, along with someone whose expensive suit and corporate bearing marked him as Technocore's real decision-maker. They weren't here to negotiate or oversee a simple eviction. They were here to witness the elimination of a problem that had cost their company time and money. But it was the third passenger that made Clay's blood freeze. Sarah sat in the helicopter's rear seat, her auburn hair catching the sunlight exactly as he remembered from 7 years ago. She looked older, marked by grief and time, but unmistakably alive, unmistakably real. Clay's hands shook as he adjusted the binoculars' focus, certain that trauma and isolation had finally snapped his mind completely. Then, Sarah turned toward his position and looked directly at him through the aircraft's window, her lips forming his name with the precision of someone who had called it 1,000 times before. The shock nearly made Clay forget about the ground assault. Advancing on his position, only the White Wolf's urgent nudge against his shoulder brought him back to immediate reality. Reeves's teams were moving into the kill zones he'd prepared, trusting their tactical superiority to carry them through whatever resistance a single mountain hermit could mount. Clay triggered the first charge with hands that trembled from more than adrenaline. The explosion brought down a section of cliff face that blocked the eastern approach route, forcing one assault team to detour through a narrow canyon where the wolves were waiting. Gunfire erupted immediately, not the controlled bursts of professional soldiers, but the panicked automatic fire of men discovering that their enemy was something they'd never trained to fight. The helicopter circled closer, and Clay could see Webb speaking urgently into a radio while the corporate executive gestured toward the chaos below. But Sarah never looked away from Clay's position, her eyes holding an intensity that cut through 7 years of grief and guilt like a blade through paper. Clay triggered the second charge, collapsing the logging road and trapping Reeves's heavy equipment in the valley. The third explosion sealed the main cave entrance, cutting off what Reeves would assume was Clay's primary escape route. Each detonation was perfectly timed, perfectly positioned, drawing the assault teams exactly where Clay needed them to be. But his attention kept returning to the helicopter, to the impossible sight of his dead wife, watching him fight for his life against corporate mercenaries. The artifact he'd carried for 7 years, Sarah's wedding ring, felt like it was burning in his pocket, a tangible connection to something that shouldn't exist. The White Wolf pressed against his side and made a sound Clay had never heard before, part growl, part whine, all urgency. When he followed her gaze, he saw what had alarmed her. The helicopter was descending, seeking a landing zone in the meadow behind his cabin. Webb and his companions weren't content to observe from a safe distance. They were joining the ground assault. That was when Clay realized the truth that recontextualized everything he thought he understood about this conflict. The helicopter touched down with rotor wash that flattened the grass and sent equipment scattered across the clearing. As the engines wound down, Clay watched through his binoculars as Webb helped Sarah from the aircraft, his hands gentle but proprietary in a way that made Clay's vision red around the edges. Sarah was alive, had been alive all these years while Clay buried himself in the mountains, drowning in guilt over deaths that had never happened. The house fire had been real, but somehow Sarah had survived, and somewhere in the 7 years since, she'd become involved with the people trying to steal his land. The White Wolf's response was immediate and unmistakable. Her hackles rose, her lips pulled back to show fangs like ivory daggers, and the sound she made was pure predatory rage. Around the mountain, Clay could hear the rest of the pack responding to her call, their howls echoing off granite walls like war cries. Clay's radio crackled to life, a frequency he'd monitored but never used, standard emergency channel for the region. Sarah's voice came through the static, tired but determined. "Clay, I know you can hear me. I know you're watching. We need to talk before anyone else gets hurt." The words hit him like physical blows. 7 years of isolation, 7 years of believing himself responsible for his family's death, 7 years of carrying guilt that had shaped every decision and destroyed every hope, all of it built on a lie he was only now beginning to understand. Clay keyed his radio with hands that shook from rage rather than fear. "Where are my sons?" The silence stretched long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. When Sarah's voice returned, it carried a weight of sadness that cut through his anger like cold steel. "They're safe, Clay. They're alive. But they're not here. And they won't be safe if you keep fighting something you can't win." Below in the valley, Colonel Reeves was regrouping his scattered forces, calling for tactical withdrawal while he assessed casualties and revised his assault plan. The wolves had bloodied his professional soldiers badly, but they hadn't broken them. The real battle was still coming. But now, Clay understood that this wasn't about mining rights or corporate greed. This was about leverage, manipulation, and the kind of psychological warfare that used a man's deepest loves against him. Somehow, Technocore had orchestrated the fire, faked his family's deaths, and spent 7 years positioning him exactly where they needed him, isolated, guilt-ridden, and psychologically vulnerable to exactly this kind of revelation. The white wolf moved closer, pressing her massive frame against Clay's legs in a gesture of support that felt almost human in its understanding. When he looked into her pale eyes, he saw intelligence that went far beyond animal instinct, the kind of ancient wisdom that recognized evil when it took human form. "Sarah," Clay said into the radio, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "If you want to talk, you come alone. No weapons, no backup, no corporate handlers. Just you and me, and the truth about what happened to our family." Sarah's response came immediately. "I can't do that, Clay. There's too much at stake now. Too much you don't understand." Clay looked down at his cabin, where Webb and the corporate executive were positioning themselves behind the helicopter while Sarah stood exposed in the clearing, a human shield disguised as a peace offering. He thought about his sons, Tommy and Jake, who would be 14 now if they were alive, old enough to understand that their father had abandoned them for 7 years based on lies. The white wolf made that conversational sound he'd come to recognize, and Clay realized she was asking a question he'd been avoiding since this all began. Not whether he would fight, but whether he was prepared to win regardless of the cost to himself or the people he'd once loved. Clay's answer was to reach for the detonator that would trigger the charges positioned around his cabin, the final act of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. "Then we do this the hard way," he whispered, and pressed the button. The explosions came in sequence, timed precisely to create maximum psychological impact while minimizing actual destruction. Clay's cabin disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris, the blast echoing off canyon walls like thunder. The helicopter rocked on its landing skids as the shock wave passed over the meadow, and through his binoculars, Clay watched Webb grab Sarah's arm and drag her toward cover that no longer existed. But Clay hadn't destroyed his home out of desperation or rage. He'd eliminated it as a tactical asset, removing the fixed position that Reeves would expect him to defend. Now, the colonel would have to locate and assault a target that could move freely through terrain. Only Clay and the wolves truly understood. The radio crackled with Webb's voice, professional composure cracking under pressure. "Barden, you're making a serious mistake. Your wife is in immediate danger, and your children's safety depends on your cooperation." Clay didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gathered the artifacts that would determine his survival in the hours ahead. His grandfather's hand-drawn maps, the remaining explosive charges, and the military compass that had guided him through 2 combat deployments. Most importantly, he retrieved the one item that might give him leverage against Technocore's psychological warfare, a digital camera he'd used to document wildlife around his property. The white wolf led him through passages that required crawling on hands and knees, following routes her pack had scouted during their weeks of observation. They emerged in a limestone chamber where the rest of the wolves had assembled, their yellow eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through hidden openings. The pack's collective silence held the weight of predators preparing for a coordinated hunt. Clay spread his grandfather's maps on the cave floor, using the military compass to orient himself precisely. The old man's careful annotations showed every defensive position within 5 miles, but more importantly, they showed the natural amphitheater, where sound carried perfectly across the mountain, a place where words spoken in normal conversation could be heard clearly from positions half a mile away. "Change of plans," Clay said into his radio, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned during 2 tours commanding engineering units under fire. "Sarah, you want to talk?" Meet me at the old prospector's cabin on Granny Ridge, alone. No backup, no weapons, no radio contact with your corporate friends. Sarah's response carried fear that couldn't be faked. Clay, I can't. They'll kill me if I leave their protection. They'll kill both of us. Then we're already dead, Clay replied, checking the load on his grandfather's rifle. Question is whether we die as pawns in their game or as people who remembered how to fight back. The silence stretched long enough that Clay wondered if they'd lost radio contact. When Sarah's voice returned, it held the tone of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade. Give me 20 minutes to convince them this is necessary for the negotiation. Granny Ridge, I remember the place. Clay terminated the radio connection and turned to the White Wolf, who had been listening with the intensity of someone following every word. Her pale eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human, and when Clay spoke to her, he no longer questioned whether she could understand complex ideas. I need to go alone, he said, knowing the words would trigger protective instincts in a creature that had already decided his survival mattered to her pack. This conversation has been 7 years in the making, and it needs to happen without witnesses who might complicate things. The White Wolf's response was immediate and emphatic, a low growl that expressed disagreement in terms that needed no translation. She moved closer, pressing her massive frame against Clay's legs in a gesture that combined affection with determination. I know, Clay said, his hand moving to scratch behind her ears with the familiarity of long partnership. But if something happens to me, your pack needs to survive. What's coming next? Reeves won't stop with eliminating one man. He'll see you as a tactical threat that needs to be neutralized. Clay opened his camera and showed the White Wolf the photographs he'd taken over the past weeks, images of her pack moving through the forest. With coordination that defied normal animal behavior, pictures that documented intelligence and tactical awareness no wildlife biologist would believe possible. The evidence that could prove these wolves were something unprecedented, something that deserved protection rather than elimination. Insurance, Clay explained, storing the camera in a waterproof bag that he secured inside his jacket. If Technocore thinks they can manipulate me with family I thought was dead, they need to understand I've got leverage of my own. The White Wolf studied the camera with the focused attention of someone understanding its significance, then made a sound that seemed like reluctant agreement. She led Clay through passages that emerged near Granny Ridge, following routes that would keep him concealed until the moment he chose to reveal himself. The old prospector's cabin sat on a shelf of granite that offered commanding views in all directions, built by someone who understood that isolation required both defensive positioning and multiple escape routes. Clay's great-great-grandfather had constructed it during the original mining boom, when men worked claims with nothing but determination and the willingness to defend what they'd found. Clay arrived first, as he'd intended, and positioned himself where he could observe Sarah's approach while remaining hidden. Through his binoculars, he watched her climb the trail alone, moving with the careful steps of someone who remembered this terrain from a different life. She looked older than her years, marked by stress and decisions that had left their weight in the lines around her eyes. But she was undeniably alive, undeniably real, undeniably the woman he'd loved enough to build a life around. When Sarah reached the cabin clearing, she called out in the voice that had once welcomed him home from work and sung lullabies to their children. Clay, I'm here. I'm alone, just like you asked. Clay stepped from concealment, his grandfather's rifle held ready, but not directly threatening. The distance between them felt like more than the 20 yards of open ground. It felt like the 7 years of grief and isolation that had shaped him into someone Sarah might not recognize. You look good, she said, and despite everything, her smile held genuine warmth. Mountain living agrees with you. Can't say the same about corporate employment, Clay replied, studying her face for signs of deception or coercion. You always did clean up nice for important meetings. Sarah's laugh held no humor. Clay, this isn't what it looks like. I never wanted any of this to happen. When they told me you were dead in Afghanistan, when they showed me the reports about casualties in engineering units, I believed them. I grieved for you. I moved on because I had to for the boys. Clay felt something cold settle in his chest. The boys who died in a house fire that never happened. The boys who are alive and safe and asking about their father every day. Sarah's voice broke slightly. Tommy's 14 now, plays guitar like you used to. Jake's still the troublemaker, but he's got your talent for fixing things that shouldn't work. The words hit Clay like physical blows. 7 years of suppressed hope and buried love rising in his throat like bile. But underneath the emotional impact, his military training was analyzing inconsistencies, looking for the psychological pressure points that marked sophisticated manipulation. If they're alive, Clay said carefully, if they've been alive all these years while I've been up here eating guilt for breakfast, why now? Why this elaborate production with mining rights and corporate mercenaries? Sarah's hesitation told him everything he needed to know about who was really in control of this conversation. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of someone reciting a script she'd been forced to memorize. Because Technocore needed you, isolated, Clay. They needed you broken down, separated from everything that might give you strength to resist. The rare earth deposit under this mountain is worth more than $200 million, but the real value is what those minerals can do for advanced weapons systems. Defense contracts that would make Technocore one of the most powerful corporations in the world. Clay understood now. This wasn't about money, it was about power. And he wasn't just an obstacle to be removed, he was an asset to be controlled. A decorated veteran with demolitions expertise, isolated and psychologically vulnerable, perfect for recruitment into operations that required someone with his specific skills and moral flexibility that came from having nothing left to lose. And if I cooperate? Clay asked, though he already knew the answer. The boys come home. We can be a family again. You get consulting work that pays better than anything you ever imagined, and our children grow up with opportunities most people can only dream about. Clay looked at the woman he'd loved, seeing her clearly for the first time in 7 years. She wasn't a victim in this scenario, she was a recruiter, someone who'd been positioned to deliver exactly the combination of hope and threat that would break down his resistance. But Technocore had made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that 7 years of isolation and guilt had left him weak, desperate for human connection at any cost. They'd never considered what those same 7 years might have taught him about the difference between loneliness and solitude, between human company and genuine alliance. Clay's answer was to key his radio to the frequency he knew Reeves was monitoring. "Colonel, this is Barden. I'm ready to discuss terms for my surrender." Reeves's voice came through the radio with the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "Smart choice, Barden. Walk down to the meadow with your hands visible and your weapon on the ground. Mrs. Barden will accompany you to ensure there's no misunderstanding about the terms." Clay looked at Sarah, seeing the relief in her eyes that she couldn't quite hide. She believed this was over, that corporate manipulation and family leverage had finally broken down his resistance. But Clay was counting on that assumption, betting everything on Technocore's conviction that he was just another isolated man who would fold under pressure. "One condition," Clay said into the radio, his voice carrying across the mountain through the natural acoustics his grandfather had mapped decades ago. "I want to see my sons before I agree to anything permanent. Video call, real-time, proof they're alive and safe." "That can be arranged," Reeves replied. "Once you're in custody and we've secured the area." Clay smiled, knowing that Reeves couldn't see his expression, but hoping the colonel could hear something in his tone that might trigger professional paranoia. "Understood. Sarah and I will be down in 10 minutes. What Reeves couldn't know was that Clay's radio transmission had been heard by more than just Technocore's assault team. The natural amphitheater where sound carried perfectly worked both ways, and somewhere in the limestone caves below, 200 wolves were listening to every word with the focused attention of apex predators coordinating a hunt. Clay shouldered his grandfather's rifle and began walking down the trail toward the meadow, Sarah beside him moving with the careful steps of someone trying not to trigger a catastrophe. But as they descended, Clay was positioning himself exactly where his grandfather's maps indicated the sound would carry farthest, where words spoken in normal conversation would echo off granite walls and reach listeners miles away. "Sarah," Clay said quietly, "before we get down there, I need you to know something about what you're really involved in." She looked at him with genuine concern. "Clay, whatever you're thinking, please don't try anything heroic. These people don't make threats they won't follow through on." Clay pulled out his camera and showed her the photographs he'd taken of the wolf pack, images that documented behavior and intelligence that defied everything science understood about animal consciousness. "Take a look at these pictures and tell me what you see." Sarah glanced at the camera screen, then did a double take that nearly made her stumble on the rocky trail. "That's impossible. Wolves don't coordinate like that. They don't show that kind of tactical awareness." "No," Clay agreed. "They don't. Which means either I've been living alongside something that shouldn't exist, or Technocore's mining operation is about to disturb something that's been protecting these mountains for longer than corporate lawyers know how to calculate." Before Sarah could respond, the forest around them erupted with movement. Not the chaotic scatter of startled wildlife, but the coordinated advance of predators who had been moving into position while their prey focused on human negotiations. Grey shapes flowed between the trees like smoke, positioning themselves with military precision along every escape route. The white wolf materialized from the shadows directly ahead of them, her pale eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made Clay's wife step closer to him despite everything that lay between them. When the wolf spoke, and there was no other word for the sound she made, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah's response was immediate and visceral. She grabbed Clay's arm with hands that shook from more than fear. "Clay, that's not natural, that's not possible. A lot of things aren't possible," Clay replied, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Like faking a house fire, hiding living children, and manipulating a man's grief for 7 years to turn him into a Bishan corporate asset." The radio crackled with Reeves's voice, impatience cutting through professional composure. "Barden, you're behind schedule. Continue your approach immediately or face the consequences." Clay keyed the radio, but this time he wasn't speaking to Reeves. He was speaking to the mountain itself, to whatever intelligence had brought 200 impossible wolves to his aid at exactly the moment when corporate greed threatened something that couldn't be replaced. "Colonel, I'm afraid there's been a change in the tactical situation. You might want to look around your positions and count how many yellow eyes are watching your men from the tree line." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Clay to imagine Reeves frantically checking his perimeter through binoculars, discovering that his professional soldiers were surrounded by predators that had appeared as silently as mountain mist. When Reeves's voice returned, it carried the edge of a man who understood. He'd walked into something beyond his training. "Barden, call off your animals, or your wife becomes the first casualty of your stupidity." Clay looked at Sarah, seeing fear and confusion and something that might have been genuine regret for the choices that had brought them to this moment. Then he looked at the white wolf, whose pale eyes held the patient intelligence of something that had been waiting 7 years for exactly this confrontation. "My animals," Clay said into the radio, "don't take orders from me." The attack came from all directions simultaneously, 200 wolves moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation that had been planned down to the second. But they weren't killing, they were herding, driving Reeves's scattered forces toward a central location where the white wolf waited with the patient authority of a general overseeing a battle she'd already won. Clay watched through his binoculars as professional soldiers discovered that their advanced training meant nothing against an enemy that understood terrain, psychology, and pack tactics on a level that transcended human military doctrine. Reeves's men found themselves disarmed, not through violence, but through the simple expedient of wolves who could anticipate every move, counter every strategy, and apply pressure with surgical precision. The radio exploded with panicked voices as the assault teams tried to coordinate a response to something they'd never trained to fight. "Contact left! Multiple hostiles! Jesus Christ, how many are there?" The professional discipline that had defined these men dissolved under pressure from predators who seemed to know exactly how to exploit every weakness in human psychology. But the White Wolf's true masterstroke was what she did to the helicopter. The aircraft sat in the meadow like a metal insect, its engines still warm and ready for immediate departure. Webb and the corporate executive had taken shelter behind its armored bulk, using the chopper as both cover and communications center while they tried to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond their corporate playbook. The White Wolf approached the helicopter alone, moving with the fluid grace of something that understood machinery as well as she understood flesh and bone. When she reached the aircraft, she did something that made Clay's breath catch in his throat. She began systematically destroying critical components with the focused intelligence of a saboteur who knew exactly which systems mattered most. Hydraulic lines severed with surgical precision, communication antennas twisted beyond repair, landing gear mechanisms damaged in ways that would prevent immediate departure. She wasn't attacking randomly, she was disabling the enemy's escape route and command structure with the tactical awareness of someone who understood modern warfare better than the men who'd brought these weapons to her. "Mountain!" Sarah grabbed Clay's arm, her voice tight with fear that had nothing to do with personal safety. "Clay, they're not animals. I don't know what they are, but they're not animals. No." Clay agreed, watching the White Wolf complete her sabotage, and turned toward the men sheltering behind the now useless aircraft. "There's something older, something that was here before mining companies and corporate lawyers and people who think everything in the world can be bought or sold." The White Wolf's call echoed across the mountain, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The scattered pack responded immediately, flowing like grey water toward the meadow, where Webb and his corporate superior found themselves surrounded by predators who had eliminated every advantage their technology provided. Reeves's voice came through the radio, professional composure finally cracking under pressure from an enemy he couldn't understand or counter. "Barden, I don't know what you've gotten involved with, but this ends. Now, call them off, or we start shooting everything that moves." Clay keyed his radio, but his response was addressed to someone else entirely. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully. In about 30 seconds, you're going to have a choice to make. You can stay with the people who've been using our family as leverage for corporate profit, or you can remember who you used to be before they convinced you that survival required abandoning everything we ever believed in. Clay, what are you?" Her question was cut off by the sound of engines approaching from the valley below. But these weren't corporate vehicles or military transports. They were pickup trucks, driven by local ranchers, men who'd received calls from Sheriff Jim Kowalski about a situation developing in the mountains that required immediate civilian assistance. Clay smiled, understanding that the White Wolf's tactical planning extended far beyond simple predator instincts. She'd positioned this confrontation exactly where it would draw the attention of people who understood that some fights were worth having, regardless of the odds or the corporate lawyers involved. The artifact that would determine the outcome of this battle wasn't technological or military, it was moral. Clay pulled out his grandfather's compass, the simple instrument that had guided 3 generations of his family through decisions about what was worth defending and what was worth sacrificing. "Webb," Clay called across the meadow, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "You wanted to negotiate terms? Here's my counteroffer. You and your people leave this mountain now, today, and never come back. In return, nobody gets hurt, and you get to explain to your corporate bosses how a mining operation worth $200 million got shut down by one man and a pack of wolves that officially don't exist. Webb's response carried the desperate authority of someone watching a carefully planned operation collapse into chaos. Barden, you're making a mistake that will cost more than your life. Technocore doesn't negotiate with terrorists, and we don't walk away from investments this large. The White Wolf's answer was to step into the open meadow where everyone could see her clearly, her pale coat catching the afternoon sunlight like something woven from mountain mist. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of something that had been protecting this land since before corporations existed. And for the first time in 7 years, Clay understood exactly what was worth fighting for. The standoff ended not with violence, but with something far more powerful. The simple truth that some things couldn't be taken by force, bought with money, or conquered through corporate manipulation. Webb's surrender came when he realized that his expensive equipment was useless, his professional soldiers were disarmed by predators that shouldn't exist, and his carefully planned operation had attracted the attention of every news outlet in 3 states. The ranchers who'd responded to Jim Kowalski's call had brought more than moral support. They'd brought cameras, journalists, and the kind of public scrutiny that made corporate cover-ups impossible. Clay watched from the ridge as Technocore's people loaded their disabled vehicles onto recovery trucks, moving with the defeated efficiency of an army in retreat. Webb's final transmission was addressed not to Clay, but to his corporate superiors, explaining how a $200 million mining operation had been terminated by circumstances beyond his control. But the real resolution came when Sarah walked up the mountain trail alone, moving with the careful steps of someone approaching a conversation that would determine the rest of her life. The White Wolf had allowed her passage, though the rest of the pack maintained their positions around the meadow with the patient attention of sentries who understood their duty wasn't finished. Clay met her at the old prospector's cabin where this confrontation had begun, his grandfather's compass steady in his hand, and 7 years of questions finally ready to be answered. "The boys," Sarah said without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "They really are alive, Clay. Everything else was lies and manipulation, but Tommy and Jake are alive and safe and asking about their father every day." Clay studied her face, looking for deception, but finding only exhaustion and regret. "Where?" "Phoenix. They think you're dead, think the army told me you were killed in Afghanistan." Technocore arranged the whole thing, faked the house fire, faked the military reports, even provided a new identity and enough money to start over. Sarah's laugh held no humor. "I thought I was protecting them by keeping them away from the grief. I thought I was being strong. And when did you learn the truth?" 6 months ago, when Technocore approached me about helping with this operation. They showed me surveillance photos of you living up here, told me you'd suffered a breakdown and become dangerous to yourself and others. Sarah's voice broke slightly. "They said the only way to help you was to convince you to accept treatment, to come back to civilization where you could get proper care." Clay understood now. Sarah hadn't been a willing participant in corporate manipulation. She'd been another victim, someone whose love for her family had been weaponized against both of them. The elaborate deception had required 7 years of careful planning, but it had nearly worked because it exploited the deepest human need to protect the people who mattered most. "The mining operation," Clay said, "the rare earth deposits, that was all real. Real enough that Technocore was willing to invest 7 years and millions of dollars to get control of this mountain." Sarah looked around at the wilderness that had become Clay's sanctuary. "But I don't think they ever understood what they were really trying to take." The White Wolf emerged from the forest shadows, moving with the fluid grace that marked her as something beyond normal animal consciousness. She approached slowly, her pale eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that seemed to weigh souls rather than assess threats. When the wolf stopped directly in front of Sarah, something passed between them that Clay couldn't quite define: recognition, perhaps, or understanding that transcended species barriers. The white wolf made that conversational sound Clay had learned to interpret as communication, and Sarah's response was immediate and visceral. "She's asking me to choose," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with wonder and fear. "Not between you and them, but between the life I've been living and the life I could still have." Clay pulled out the artifact that had defined this entire confrontation. Sarah's wedding ring, worn smooth by 7 years of carrying it like a talisman of guilt and loss. But now, looking at his wife's face in the afternoon light, he understood that some promises could survive deception, manipulation, and even the kind of corporate evil that used families as weapons. "The boys," he said, holding out the ring that had never really belonged to him alone. "Can we bring them home?" Sarah's answer was to take the ring and slip it back onto her finger, where it caught the mountain sunlight like hope made visible. They never stopped asking about their father, never stopped believing you were coming back. The white wolf's howl filled the mountain air, a sound of completion and satisfaction that seemed to resonate from the granite itself. Around the meadow, the rest of the pack began to disperse, flowing back into the wilderness like morning mist, returning to the valleys where it belonged. But the white wolf remained, looking at Clay with those intelligent, pale eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. When she turned and began walking toward the deep forest, Clay knew he was being invited to follow not as a master with a pet, but as a partner in something larger than human understanding. Sarah's hand found his, warm and real and familiar, despite the years that lay between them. "Clay, whatever happens next, whatever we decide, I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Even when I believed you were dead, even when they convinced me that moving on was the only way to protect our family." Clay looked at his wife, at the mountain that had sheltered him through 7 years of exile, and at the impossible wolf that had brought them all to this moment of choice. He thought about his sons, growing up in Phoenix, believing their father was dead, and about the life they could still build together if they were brave enough to trust that some kinds of love survived everything the world could do to destroy them. "Come on," he said, leading Sarah down the mountain toward a future that suddenly seemed possible again. "Let's go bring our boys home." Behind them, the white wolf watched until they disappeared into the valley, then turned and vanished into the wilderness that had always been her true domain. The mountains settled into peaceful silence, protected once again by forces older and wiser than corporate greed could ever comprehend.